Waitress warned the billionaire not to enter the car. After hearing the guards speak German, what if the person serving your coffee knew more about your life than the people you trusted most? Helen Garrett had been waiting tables at Murphy's Diner for 23 years, and she'd developed an ear for trouble. That Tuesday morning in October, when the black cars pulled up outside her window, she noticed something that made her hands shake as she poured the coffee. The man in the expensive suit looked tired, older than his 42 years, with worry lines that spoke of sleepless nights. But it wasn't him that caught her attention. It was the two men flanking him, speaking in hushed German, thinking nobody would understand. Helen's late husband had taught her the language during their travels through Europe, and what she heard made her blood run cold. They weren't protecting this man. They were planning something that would destroy him. As she approached their table with trembling hands, Helen faced a choice that would change everything. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The morning rush at Murphy's Diner usually brought familiar faces. Construction workers grabbing coffee before dawn, elderly couples sharing their Tuesday tradition of pancakes and conversation. Helen knew them all by name, remembered how they liked their eggs, and asked about their grandchildren. It was the kind of place where strangers became regulars and regulars became family. But these three men didn't belong to that world. The one in the center, clearly the leader, had kind eyes that reminded Helen of her own son. His name was David Chen, though she wouldn't learn that until later. He'd built his fortune in technology, starting from nothing after his parents immigrated from Taiwan. At 42, he'd recently lost his wife to cancer, and the grief sat heavy on his shoulders like an old coat he couldn't take off. His company was worth billions, but sitting in that vinyl booth he looked like any other man carrying too much weight. The two guards flanked him with military precision. Klaus, the older one with graying temples, kept checking his watch. His younger partner, Franz, had cold blue eyes that swept the diner constantly. They ordered in English, their accents barely noticeable, but when they thought no one was listening, they switched to German. Helen refilled their coffee cups, her waitress's smile masking growing unease. She'd learned German from her late husband Robert during their anniversary trips to Bavaria. He'd been fascinated by the language, the culture, the history. Those precious memories now served an unexpected purpose as she caught fragments of the guard's conversation. "Nach dem Mittagessen," Klaus murmured, stirring sugar into his coffee. "After lunch. Der Wagen ist bereit. The car is ready." Franz nodded, glancing at David, who was absorbed in reading emails on his phone, oblivious to the planning happening inches away. Helen's heart raced as she pieced together their words. Something about timing, about making it look natural, about ensuring there would be no witnesses. The way Klaus emphasized keine Zeugen, no witnesses, sent a chill down her spine. That had nothing to do with the October wind, rattling the diner's windows. David looked up as she approached with the coffee pot again, offering her a genuinely grateful smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "This is exactly what I needed today." His kindness made her decision for her. Whatever these men were planning, this decent man deserved a warning. Helen's mind raced as she watched the three men finish their breakfast. David had been nothing but polite, even asking about the local high school when he noticed her proud grandma pin. He'd mentioned having a scholarship program for students interested in technology, his eyes lighting up when he talked about giving kids opportunities his parents never had. Everything about him radiated decency and genuine care for others. The guards, however, continued their whispered planning. Klaus checked his phone repeatedly, and Helen caught enough to understand they were coordinating with someone else. "Der Boss wartet," Franz said quietly. "The boss is waiting." When Klaus responded with something about insurance money and accident, Helen's worst fears crystallized. During her break, Helen stepped outside for air, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette, a habit she'd picked up after Robert's funeral and never quite managed to quit. Through the window, she watched David laugh at something on his phone, probably a text from family or friends. He had no idea that the men paid to protect him were planning his death. The moral weight pressed down on her like a stone. She was just a waitress from small-town Ohio, a grandmother who worried about making rent and whether her arthritis would get worse. What business did she have involving herself in the affairs of billionaires and dangerous men? But then she remembered her Robert, how he'd always said that good people had to speak up when they saw wrong being done, no matter how scary it seemed. As the men prepared to leave, Helen noticed Klaus slide a small device under David's coffee cup, something tiny and black that looked like a tracking device. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this wasn't just talk. They were actually going to hurt him, probably before the day was over. The moment of truth came when David stood to pay his bill. His guards were already outside, speaking rapid German into their phones. Helen approached the counter, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Chen," she said, reading his name from the credit card, "I need to tell you something important. Don't get in that car. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." David turned, confusion replacing his earlier warmth. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" The guards were heading back inside, their conversation finished, professional smiles replacing their earlier intensity. Helen's throat went dry as the guards approached. She could see suspicion growing in Klaus's eyes as he noticed her proximity to David. But she'd come too far to back down now. "Please," she whispered urgently to David, "I speak German. I heard what they were saying. They're planning to hurt you." David's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "What are you talking about?" He glanced at his guards, who were now close enough to hear. Klaus stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is there a problem here?" Klaus asked, his accent more pronounced now that he was focused. Helen felt her courage wavering under his cold stare. This man had probably killed before, probably wouldn't hesitate to hurt an old waitress who knew too much. "No problem," David said carefully, but Helen could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was a successful businessman because he knew how to read people, and something in her desperate expression was getting through to him. "Ma'am, could you excuse us for a moment?" Helen's hands trembled as she nodded, stepping back toward the kitchen. But she positioned herself where she could still see the booth, where she could watch what happened next. Her heart broke as she thought about her own family, her daughter Lisa, her grandson Danny, who was starting college next year. If these men decided she was a threat, would they come for her family too? Through the kitchen window she watched David having a quiet conversation with his guards. Klaus was gesturing dismissively, probably explaining away her concerns as the ramblings of a confused old woman. Franz kept checking his phone, clearly anxious to move forward with whatever they had planned, but David wasn't dismissing her warning. Helen could see him asking questions, pressing for details about their route, their timing. When Klaus's answers seemed to frustrate him, David made a decision that surprised everyone. He stood up and walked back toward the counter. "Ma'am," he said quietly, positioning himself so the guards couldn't hear. "Tell me exactly what you heard." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd learned not to ignore his instincts, who'd survived in business by listening to warnings others might dismiss. "Have you ever faced something like this, where speaking up felt dangerous but staying silent felt worse? Let us know in the comments." Helen took a deep breath and made the choice that would haunt her dreams for weeks but save a life. "They said after lunch the car is ready," she whispered. "Something about no witnesses, about making it look natural. And insurance money." She watched David's face pale as the implications sank in. "They put something under your coffee cup," she added, small and black. "I think it's a tracker." David's jaw tightened. Without looking back at his guards, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my head of security," he said quietly. "The real one. These men were hired yesterday by my business partner, Marcus Steinberg. I was starting to have doubts about Marcus anyway." His fingers flew over the phone screen. "My regular security team had a sudden food poisoning outbreak last night. Should have been my first clue." Klaus and Franz were getting restless, clearly wanting to move David along. Helen watched as David sent what looked like a very urgent text message, then calmly walked back to his table. "Gentlemen," he said with forced casualness, "I just need to make one quick call outside. Business emergency." "We should all go together," Klaus insisted, but David shook his head. "Just give me 2 minutes. The signal's better by the parking meter." He stepped outside, phone already to his ear. Through the window, Helen watched him speaking rapidly to someone. Within minutes, she could see police cars in the distance, approaching without sirens. Franz noticed them first, his hand moving toward his jacket. But Klaus grabbed his arm, shaking his head slightly. They were professionals enough to know when a job had gone sideways. Without a word to each other, they stood and walked quickly toward the back exit of the diner. David returned just as the police cars pulled up front. "They're gone," Helen said, surprised by how relieved she felt. "Good," David replied, "because Detective Morrison is going to want to hear your statement." He paused, looking at this ordinary woman who'd risked everything to save a stranger. "My security chief, Marcus, is already in custody. Seems he owed some very bad people a lot of money, and my life insurance policy was his solution. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales." Helen sank onto a nearby stool, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "I just couldn't let them hurt you," she said simply. 3 months later, Helen was still getting used to the changes in her life. The reward money David had insisted on giving her, despite her protests, had eliminated her financial worries for the first time in years. Her grandson, Danny's college tuition was secure, and she'd even been able to take her first vacation since Robert died. But the biggest change wasn't financial. David had become a regular at Murphy's Diner, stopping by every Tuesday morning for coffee and conversation. He'd grown thinner since his wife's death, but the haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something that looked like hope. "Helen," he said that particular Tuesday, sliding into his usual booth, "I have something to tell you." He looked nervous, almost shy, which was unusual for a man who regularly addressed boardrooms full of executives. "What's that, honey?" Helen asked, refilling his coffee cup with practiced ease. "I'm starting a foundation. For people like you, everyday heroes who speak up when they see wrong being done." He pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. "The Helen Garrett Foundation for Everyday Courage. We're going to give grants to people who risk their own safety to help others." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "David, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "You saved my life because it was the right thing to do. You didn't know who I was. Didn't know if I'd believe you. Didn't know if those men would come after you. But you spoke up anyway." He paused, his own eyes growing misty. "My wife used to say that ordinary people doing extraordinary things are what keep the world from falling apart. You proved her right." The other customers in the diner had grown quiet, sensing something special happening. Old Mr. Patterson, who'd been coming for coffee and pie every morning for 15 years, wiped his eyes with his napkin. Betty Morrison, the detective's wife, squeezed Helen's shoulder as she walked past. "There's one more thing," David said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small framed photograph of him with an Asian woman who had kind eyes and a radiant smile. "This is my wife, Linda. I wanted her to meet you in a way." He set the photo on the table between them. "She would have loved your courage." Helen picked up the photo, studying the woman's face. "She looks like she was wonderful." She was. "And she taught me that the best way to honor someone's memory is to keep doing good in the world." David smiled, the first truly peaceful expression Helen had seen on his face. "So that's what we're going to do." As Helen looked around the diner, at the familiar faces, the worn vinyl booths, the place where an ordinary Tuesday morning had changed 2 lives forever, she felt Robert's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. He would have been proud. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining Helen and David on this journey of courage, kindness, and the power of speaking up for what's right.